My name is Thomas Ellery, and I am 76 years old. When people hear that number, most of them immediately think of an old man bent under the weight of time, someone half forgotten, half useless, a presence tolerated rather than cherished. I suppose that is how I appear to many, and perhaps even to my own daughter, though I never thought the day would come when her eyes would look at me with that same faint embarrassment one reserves for someone who has overstayed his welcome. I live in the same modest house where my late wife and I built our life together more than 40 years ago, a house that is far too big for one man now, but I could never leave it, not because of stubbornness, but because every wall and every floorboard still carries the echo of her laughter, the sound of her steps in the hallway, the smell of her cooking drifting from the kitchen. To me, these things are alive. They are my companions in solitude. My days are simple and unhurried. I wake up early, not because of necessity, but because sleep rarely lingers long for me anymore. The first light of morning sneaks in through the curtains and reminds me of all the dawns I once shared with Margaret, my wife. She would already be awake, humming some forgotten tune while she set the kettle on the stove. Now it is me who shuffles to the kitchen, who carefully measures out the coffee grounds the way she liked, as if by repeating her ritual I might summon her presence back into the room. The taste is never quite right, but the gesture matters. Breakfast is usually nothing more than a piece of toast or oatmeal, but I set it carefully on the plate, not rushing, not careless. The small acts of order help me face the emptiness that follows. I do not go out much anymore. My knees ache on damp days, and my breath shortens when I attempt longer walks, though I used to be a strong man, a soldier once, and later an office worker who never missed a day of labor. Now the world outside seems to move faster than I can, and I often feel that it has left me behind. Still, I keep myself occupied with little things, tending the small garden in the back, sorting old photographs, rereading books that Margaret loved. Sometimes I sit at my desk and open the drawers where I keep my papers, folders filled with documents, letters, even the yellowed notebook where I wrote down my thoughts during service overseas. These papers may look unimportant to others, but for me, they are the map of my life. My wife's handwriting appears in the margins of recipes she copied, in letters she sent me when I was stationed far from home, in the careful notes she kept about the bills and the household. There is also the will, drafted years ago and updated after she passed, in which I tried to make sense of what little wealth we accumulated, to leave behind some trace of fairness and care for our family. I keep all of it stacked neatly, tied with twine, as though the order might prevent the past from slipping away. My clothing, I admit, is old. Most of my shirts were bought decades ago, sturdy cotton that is faded but not torn. I own 2 suits, one that I wore to church and family gatherings, the other that I wore to Margaret's funeral. Both hang in the wardrobe, wrapped in covers, waiting for occasions that rarely arrive. Day to day, I wear wool sweaters with patched elbows and trousers that might look antiquated to those accustomed to modern fashions. To me, they are comfortable and sufficient, and I have never cared much for appearances. Margaret used to tease me gently, telling me that if I ever became a widower, I would still be wearing the same jacket until it turned to dust. She was right, of course, and in a way, holding on to those garments is like holding on to her voice. I do not feel shame in it, though I know others might see me as shabby, perhaps even ridiculous. My daughter, Eleanor, visits occasionally, not often, and usually with a tone of obligation rather than warmth, as though ticking off a box in a long list of duties. She is successful in her career, busy with clients and deadlines, and she has 2 teenage children who hardly know me except as the quiet old man they see on holidays. I do not blame them entirely. The world they inhabit is filled with bright screens and quick distractions, and I am little more than a shadow on the edge of their awareness. Still, each time they come, I try to engage them with stories from my youth, with lessons their grandmother taught me, with the sort of conversations that once bound families together. More often than not, they nod politely, their eyes wandering back to the glow of their phones. Eleanor is not unkind, not overtly cruel, but there is a sharpness in her voice sometimes when she looks around my house. She complains about the clutter, about the dust, about the smell of old books. She urges me to sell the house, to move into a smaller place or even a senior residence where, as she puts it, I would be looked after. She does not realize that her words wound me not because they suggest weakness, but because they reduce my life to something that should be managed rather than lived. I tell her gently that I prefer to remain where I am, that I am capable of cooking my meals, paying my bills, and maintaining the little routines that give me purpose. She sighs and nods, but her eyes say she has already decided otherwise. There are moments when I catch her studying my clothes, the way my sweater hangs loose on my shoulders, the scuffed shoes I polish myself. She smiles faintly, sometimes laughs, as though my appearance is a small joke at my expense. I pretend not to notice, though inside I feel the sting. It is not vanity that hurts me, but the realization that she sees me no longer as her father, the man who once carried her on his shoulders, taught her to ride a bicycle, sat awake with her during fevers, but merely as a caricature of age, a relic. She feels obliged to endure. Margaret would not have allowed such distance to grow between us. She would have reminded Eleanor of the roots that nourished her, of the sacrifices made so she could study, work, and build the life she now prizes. Without Margaret's presence, however, I stand alone against that wall of indifference. Evenings are the hardest. I eat a light dinner, usually soup or a piece of fish, and then sit by the radio or television, letting the noise fill the silence. Sometimes I pour a glass of wine, though rarely, because drinking alone sharpens rather than softens the ache of solitude. Before bed, I open the drawer with my papers again. I leaf through the pages slowly, almost reverently. Here is the deed to the house, signed when Margaret and I were young and hopeful. Here are the letters she wrote telling me about Eleanor's first steps, about the roses that bloomed in the garden, about how she missed me. Here is the will, revised after she died, in which I tried to balance love with fairness, to ensure that Eleanor would be provided for, but that our grandchildren would also have a future secured. These papers, fragile as they are, give me strength. They remind me that I am more than an old man in worn clothes. I am the sum of promises kept, of duties fulfilled, of love endured through decades. If strangers saw me walking slowly down the street in my threadbare coat, they might assume I had little to my name. They would be wrong. I have memories richer than any account. I have dignity preserved in those papers, and I have the quiet certainty that I lived my life with honesty. Yet the irony is that my own daughter, who should know this better than anyone, sometimes sees nothing but the surface. She looks at the coat and not the man, at the shoes and not the path they carried him through. And though I swallow my pride and let her laughter pass, inside me there is a quiet storm, a question that will not leave me. How did the bond between father and daughter erode into this brittle exchange of politeness and mockery? I sit now at my desk, the evening deepening outside, and I wonder if someday she will open these papers after I'm gone and finally understand. Perhaps then, and only then, will she see that what seemed to her an old man's clutter was in truth the very scaffolding of her own life, the foundation laid down long before she had the words to name it. Until that day, I will endure her laughter, her impatience, and her distance. I am her father still, and though I have little left to give in appearance, I still hold the weight of legacy in my hands, quietly waiting for the moment when truth will matter more than fashion. It was on a Saturday in late autumn, the kind of day when the air is already sharp with the promise of winter, that Eleanor arrived at my house without calling beforehand. The maple trees in front of the yard had shed most of their leaves, and the wind carried the dry remnants across the porch like a whisper of things ending. I had just finished sweeping the path and was about to sit with a book when her car pulled up, sleek and polished, an emblem of her world so far removed from mine. She stepped out in a fitted coat and leather boots, her hair perfectly arranged, her perfume trailing ahead of her like a declaration of control. Behind her, the grandchildren followed slowly, reluctant and restless, their eyes already fixed on the glowing devices in their hands. She walked into the house as though it were a place she visited out of duty rather than belonging, her eyes sweeping across the furniture, the photographs on the walls, the smell of old wood and cooked cabbage that lingered from the night before. "You still keep it the same," she said, not as a compliment but as an accusation, as though my refusal to change the curtains or replace the sofa were proof of my stubbornness. I welcomed her with the warmth I could muster, offering tea and biscuits, but she brushed aside the gesture, already moving toward the living room with a purposeful stride. It was then that she noticed my clothes. I had been wearing an old cardigan, one Margaret had mended many times, the elbows patched with brown fabric that did not match but carried her touch. My trousers, ironed but faded, hung loosely from my thinning frame, and my shoes bore the marks of many years. Eleanor stopped in the middle of the room, tilted her head, and let out a laugh, sharp, dismissive. Not the laugh of a daughter greeting her father, but the laugh of someone pointing out a spectacle. "Dad," she said loudly enough for the children to look up, "you look like you've stepped straight out of a thrift store catalog from 1950. Don't you have anything decent to wear?" "Honestly, you embarrass yourself." The words stung more than I allowed to show. I tried to smile, to shrug it off, as if her remark were nothing. But I saw the children glance at each other and snicker. It was not the sound of innocent amusement, but the echo of their mother's disdain passing into their mouths. I wanted to remind her that these clothes were not rags, but part of my life, that the cardigan was the last garment touched by her mother's hands, that the shoes had carried me through the years of providing for her education, her comfort, her future. But pride and silence wrestled within me, and silence won. Instead, I said softly, "They are clean, and they keep me warm. That is enough." Eleanor rolled her eyes and laughed again, shaking her head. "You're impossible. No wonder you sit alone all the time. Who would want to be seen with you looking like this?" The cruelty of her words was disguised as casual banter, but it cut deeper than any deliberate insult. We sat for tea, though she hardly touched hers, busy scrolling through her phone and sending curt instructions to the children. The air was heavy, and I tried to stir conversation by asking about their studies, about her work, about whether she had visited Margaret's grave recently. She answered each question briefly, as though swatting away a fly. Then, after a pause in which she studied me with a calculating expression, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Dad, we need to talk about your affairs. You're not getting any younger, and it's important to have everything in order while you're still clear-minded." She chose the last phrase with deliberate care, watching me as if to gauge whether I would take offense. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft seeping through the window. "My affairs?" I repeated. She nodded, crossing her legs, her boot tapping impatiently against the rug. "Yes. The house, the bills, the savings. You've got all these papers lying around in those old folders, but no one knows what's in them. If something were to happen to you, it would be chaos. It would be much simpler if you let me handle it. You could sign a power of attorney, or at least show me what you've planned. That way I could make sure everything is managed properly." The children were not listening, but I heard every syllable. She spoke as though my life had already reached its epilogue, as though my only remaining role was to hand over the keys, the deeds, the decisions. I answered calmly, "I have kept everything in order. Your mother and I were always meticulous. You needn't worry." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But I do worry, Dad. I see you in these old clothes, living in this outdated house, and I think to myself, what if you start forgetting things? What if you leave the stove on? What if you sign something you don't understand? It happens all the time with people your age. I just want to protect you, and protect what you'll leave behind." Her words were dressed in the costume of concern, but underneath I heard the true music, impatience, calculation, the desire to secure her inheritance before time could erase her, opportunity. I remembered Margaret warning me years ago in quieter tones that Eleanor had grown too practical, too hungry for stability and appearance, forgetting that love and loyalty were worth more than possessions. I had defended her then, saying she was ambitious, not cold. Now, watching her speak about my affairs as though they were assets to be harvested, I felt Margaret's absence like a blade twisting in my chest. The conversation drifted, but the seed had been planted. Every glance she gave me that afternoon carried a mixture of irritation and appraisal, as though she were both daughter and auditor, measuring the worth of what I still possessed. She criticized the curtains, the creaking steps, the peeling paint on the porch, all in the same tone with which she mocked my clothing. Yet beneath the criticism was a strange urgency, a restless energy that betrayed her intention. She had not come merely to laugh at me, but to probe, to find a way to unlock the papers she knew I guarded. When she finally rose to leave, gathering the children and ushering them toward the car, she turned at the doorway and said with a forced smile, "Next time, Dad, maybe put on something that doesn't make you look like a beggar, and think seriously about letting me see those papers of yours. You don't want things to become messy later." She said it lightly, but the weight of it hung in the air long after the door closed and the sound of her car faded down the street. I stood alone in the quiet house, the laughter of my daughter still echoing against the walls like a cruel refrain, and I understood that her visit had not been a gesture of affection, but the beginning of something else. Something colder, more deliberate. She was not looking at me as a father anymore. She was looking at me as a ledger. And though I tried to steady my heart with reason, a shadow of dread settled over me, whispering that soon she would return, not for tea or conversation, but for the very documents that defined the last remnants of my dignity. The days following Eleanor's visit lingered in my mind like a bruise that would not fade, a reminder of how easily laughter can become a blade when it comes from the lips of your own child. I tried to shake it off, telling myself she had only been careless, that perhaps her words were not meant as cruelly as they sounded. Yet the memory of her laughter at my clothes returned each time I reached for the old cardigan or buttoned my worn shirt. I continued with my routines as always, polishing my shoes, trimming the hedge in the yard, preparing my meals with slow precision. But the silence in the house seemed heavier than before, as if the very walls had absorbed her judgment and were now echoing it back at me. I told myself that she would not return soon, that her busy life and her constant preoccupations would keep her away. But scarcely a week later, her car appeared again in the driveway, gleaming under the pale November sun like some foreign thing that did not belong to the modest gravel path it rested on. This time she came alone, without the children, and that in itself was enough to put me on guard. She entered the house briskly, her perfume preceding her once again, and without the pretense of greeting she sat down in the living room and crossed her legs, her boot tapping against the floor as though she were already impatient for me to say what she had come to hear. I offered tea as always, though she waved her hand, refusing, her eyes fixed on me with that calculating look I had come to dread. "Dad," she began, her tone clipped and businesslike, "I've been thinking about what we talked about last week, about your affairs. It really is irresponsible to leave things as they are. I've been speaking with a colleague at work. She handles estate planning, and she confirmed what I suspected. If something happened to you tomorrow, everything would be a mess. It could take months, even years, to sort through your estate, the house, the bank accounts, even the pension. Do you want that kind of chaos for your grandchildren?" The way she asked the question was not that of a daughter concerned for her father's peace of mind, but of a lawyer cross-examining a witness. Her eyes did not soften, and her hands remained folded tightly in her lap. I sat quietly for a moment, then replied, "Everything is already in order. Your mother and I made sure of it years ago. The papers are all here, arranged carefully. There is no chaos, not unless someone chooses to make it so." She leaned forward, her voice tightening. "But how do I know that, Dad? How do I know you haven't made mistakes? You keep everything in those old folders, but you're not trained for this. You don't know the latest regulations. You could have signed something without realizing what it meant. You could have left things undone. What if the house ends up entangled in disputes? What if the bank refuses to release funds because of an error? You think you're being responsible, but really, you're gambling with the future." Her words stung because they carried an undercurrent that went beyond the practical. She was telling me in so many ways that she no longer trusted me, that in her eyes my mind was suspect, my memory unreliable, my judgment already compromised by age. I wanted to protest, to tell her that each page had been reviewed carefully, that the lawyer who helped Margaret and me draft the will had explained every line, that my mind was still clear and sharp, but I saw in her expression that no assurance would suffice. She had already decided I was incompetent, or worse, that she wanted others to see me as such. "You should let me take the papers," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, "just to review them. I'll bring them back, of course, but at least I'll know everything is correct. I could store them safely, too. You know this house isn't exactly secure. What if there was a fire or a break-in? Then everything would be gone, and all your careful planning would be for nothing. I shook my head slowly. The papers stay here. They are safe, and they are mine to keep. I tried to keep my tone gentle, but I saw her jaw tighten. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply through her nose, and for a moment we sat in the silence, the air between us dense with tension. Finally she spoke again, this time with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're so stubborn, Dad. Always have been. That's why Mom had to handle everything. She was the practical one, and you've always been sentimental, clinging to things, to old clothes, old habits, old ways of thinking. But life doesn't work like that anymore. Things have to be planned properly. You can't just assume it will all fall into place." Her words carried the familiar sting of dismissal, the way she lumped together my cardigan, my routines, my very sense of self, as though everything about me were outdated, unfit for the present. But what hurt more was her invocation of Margaret, as though she could recruit the memory of her mother to her side, twisting her into an argument against me. Margaret had indeed been practical, but never in a way that belittled me. She balanced me, she steadied me, but she never stripped me of dignity. To hear Eleanor suggest otherwise felt like a betrayal, not only of me, but of her memory. I tried to end the conversation by standing, moving toward the window, and pointing out the rosebush Margaret had planted decades ago, still managing to bloom even in the chill of autumn. "Your mother believed in resilience," I said softly, "and she taught me that what endures is not what shines brightest at first, but what is tended to with care. These papers, these clothes, this house, they may look old to you, but they carry the weight of that care. That is what matters." Eleanor did not answer. Instead, she glanced at her watch, muttered something about being late for another appointment, and rose to leave. At the door, she paused, turning back to me with a look that mixed frustration and pity. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. You think you're protecting something, but really you're just delaying the inevitable. You can't keep control forever. Eventually someone will have to step in, and if you don't let me do it, then strangers will. Is that what you want?" I did not answer. I watched her walk down the path, her heels clicking against the stones, her coat whipping slightly in the wind. As the car engine roared to life and she drove away, I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest like a stone. It was not just the laughter at my clothes anymore, not just the casual cruelty of mockery. It was something larger, something darker, a campaign of doubt, a slow erosion of trust, a preparation for a battle I had not wanted, but could no longer avoid. That night, as I sat at my desk with the lamp casting its circle of light over the folders, I opened them one by one, reading again the lines of the will, the deeds, the bank statements. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from the realization that these papers, once merely records of a life lived, had become the battlefield on which my dignity would be defended or surrendered. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and I thought of Eleanor's laughter, her words about inevitability, and for the first time I admitted to myself that my own daughter was preparing to strip me of more than just my papers. She was preparing to strip me of my authority, my independence, my very identity, and I resolved in that moment that I would not let her succeed, not without a fight, not while breath and reason still remained within me. It was not long after Eleanor's second visit that the true nature of her intentions revealed itself to me, not through anything she said directly to my face, but through words she thought I would never hear. I had been sitting in the kitchen one evening, the lamp glowing softly, my cup of tea cooling on the table beside me, when the sound of her voice carried through the hallway from the living room. She had arrived suddenly, as she often did, claiming she had only a few minutes to spare, but in those few minutes she had managed to make several phone calls, each conducted with the brisk authority of someone used to giving orders. I had excused myself, retreating quietly into the kitchen, but I did not expect her voice to rise in the way it did, clear enough that the walls themselves seemed to conspire in bringing her words to me. "I've seen the papers," she was saying, her tone sharp, hurried, almost triumphant. "Yes, the house is included, and the accounts. But the way it's structured, it'll all just sit there if we don't act. He thinks he's got it locked away, but honestly, it won't matter. Once he starts slipping, we can intervene. No court will let him keep control if he's clearly losing track of things. I just need to be prepared. We'll sell the property, of course. Yes, the land alone is worth plenty, and the house can go too. He doesn't need it. He hardly lives in most of it now. It's just a waste. The important thing is making sure it doesn't get tied up in probate forever. That's why I need to get him to sign over authority before it's too late. Her words fell into me like cold stones. For a moment I thought I must have misheard, that she could not possibly be speaking of me as though I were already gone, as though the home where she had grown up, the rooms where her mother's laughter once rang, were no more than real estate, waiting to be liquidated. I wanted to step into the room to confront her, but something in me froze. It was as though I were standing outside of myself, listening, not as a father to his daughter, but as a man overhearing a stranger's scheme. The voice was hers, but the heart behind it was unrecognizable to me. I sat there, unmoving, as she continued her conversation. "The trick," she said, "is making sure he doesn't realize what's happening. He's stubborn, but he's also sentimental. He clings to old things, old habits. That makes him predictable. If I can get him to think I'm only helping, that I'm the responsible one cleaning up after him, then he'll let me in. Once I have access, we can manage everything. The kids will benefit in the long run. He doesn't need to know every detail. Why upset him with things he won't understand?" She laughed then, a sound so foreign, so hard, that I felt my stomach twist. I did not hear the rest. I rose quietly, stepping away before the words could crush me further. My tea was cold when I returned to the table, but I drank it anyway, my hands trembling as I lifted the cup. The bitter taste lingered on my tongue, and I thought of Margaret, of what she would have said if she were here. She had always believed in Eleanor's cleverness, but she had also warned me that cleverness without compassion could turn into cruelty. That night I understood exactly what she had meant. Later, when Eleanor came into the kitchen to say goodbye, her face was composed, her voice sweetened artificially, as though nothing had passed her lips but ordinary pleasantries. She kissed my cheek lightly and reminded me once again that I ought to consider letting her help with the paperwork. And then she was gone, her car pulling out of the driveway with its usual decisive roar. I stood at the window watching the taillights vanish into the dark, and I realized with a kind of hollow certainty that the line between us had been crossed. She was no longer merely impatient with my ways, no longer merely mocking of my clothes or my habits. She was planning, maneuvering, constructing a future in which I was little more than an obstacle to be managed. That night, for the first time in many years, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick in the hallway, my mind racing with images of strangers walking through the house, measuring rooms, discussing prices, erasing the life Margaret and I had built here. I saw Eleanor signing papers, her hand steady, her eyes cold, while mine were ignored as the hand of someone unfit to decide. I felt the walls closing in on me, not from age or frailty, but from betrayal. And as I lay there, I made a quiet vow to myself. I would not allow it. I would not let my life, my memories, my dignity be stripped away by the ambition of my own child. If she believed me too weak, too distracted, then I would show her that I still had strength enough to resist. When morning came, I rose earlier than usual, determined to examine every paper once again. I spread them across the table, smoothing the edges, rereading the will, the deeds, the accounts. My eyes scanned the familiar lines, and though the words had not changed, their meaning had sharpened. These were not just documents now, they were my shield. Eleanor thought she could twist them into weapons against me, but she did not know how carefully Margaret and I had prepared, how deliberately we had ensured that what we built would not be squandered. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt her presence beside me, steadying me, guiding my hands as I placed each paper back into its folder. The midpoint of a man's life is marked by the choices he makes for the future. The midpoint of mine in these final years was marked by the choice to defend the past. I knew then that what lay ahead would not be a simple disagreement between father and daughter, but a reckoning, and though I grieved for what had been lost between us, I steeled myself for what was to come. In the week that followed my vow to defend what Margaret and I had built, the air itself seemed to change inside the house, as though the rooms had been listening and now braced for a storm. I continued my rituals with careful deliberation, not to hide in routine, but to keep my mind steady, polishing the silver that had belonged to my mother, pressing the shirts I still preferred despite their age, and revisiting the folders each night with a patience that felt both monastic and martial, for I sensed that Eleanor would not approach me head-on any more, but would try to surround me with the appearance of reason, until I mistook surrender for prudence. She did not disappoint. She arrived one afternoon with a brightness too polished to be natural, and with a tall man in a tailored suit whom she introduced as a friend from her office, a financial advisor who helped families streamline transitions, and she spoke quickly about efficiencies and best practices while he complimented the house with the practiced ease of someone who appraises before he praises. He asked after my health with an interest that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with timing, and before tea could cool he had produced a neat stack of forms printed on thick paper that smelled faintly of ink and authority, suggesting that if I would only initial here and sign there, Eleanor could take the administrative weight off my shoulders so I could enjoy my golden years without anxiety. I kept my hands folded, feeling the tremor of age and anger competing in my fingers, and I told him that weight, when it carries memory and duty, is not a burden, but a privilege, that my shoulders still knew the difference, and that the papers he so kindly brought could rest on the table until they turned to dust for all I cared, because they were not meant for my pen. Eleanor's smile hardened at the edges, and her friend, who had counted on the soft capitulation of the elderly, recalculated his approach and began speaking about fireproof safes and digital vaults and the vulnerability of paper in an uncertain world. But I had listened to other men in other eras make the same argument for the surrender of something precious in exchange for an abstract promise of safety, and I knew the shape of that trade, so I offered them both the same tea I had offered at the start and nothing else. Humiliation followed persuasion as predictably as night follows dusk. When the advisor left, Eleanor stayed, drifting not toward the door, but toward my desk with an innocence I would have believed when she was 10, but could not afford to believe now. And she asked again, in a voice softened with feigned concern, whether she might at least organize my folders so that, in case of an emergency, she would know where to find the essentials. And I told her that in case of an emergency she should call me, for I would still be here, and she laughed in that careless way that made me feel like a curiosity, then reached for the topmost folder before I could stop her, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who had already decided ownership. She flipped through insurance declarations and utility ledgers as if thumbing a catalog, and when she reached the envelope that held the latest version of my will, she froze, perhaps because she recognized the form or because some instinct told her that this was the core, the hearth, the thing that could not be turned into a spreadsheet without burning her hands. I saw the calculation in her face falter, and she asked, too lightly, if I minded her taking a quick look, to ensure that the language was clear. And I answered that the language would be very clear to the people it concerned, and that if she opened that envelope without my leave, she would be robbing not just me, but the memory of her mother, who had signed the earlier versions with a faith in our daughter that I had never thought I would need to defend. She looked at me with a flash of anger that made me briefly remember her as a child denied a toy. Then she slipped the envelope back with a show of restraint, and I let the moment pass because I sensed, as one senses a cold draft in an old house, that she would find her way to it by other means. That night I moved the will and several documents, bank authorizations, the deed, the letter Margaret had written for our grandchildren to be read when they were ready, into a flat canvas bag and walked them quietly through the early dark to a safe deposit box I had not used in years, feeling in the cold metal of the bank door and the heavy hush of the vault a kind of mercy that brick and memory could not provide. When I returned, I left in the desk only copies and the harmless clutter of a life and I slept for the first time in days with the knowledge that if the storm came through my windows, the heart of the house would be elsewhere. The storm did not wait. It arrived in the form of a call from my physician's office for a routine cognitive screening that Eleanor had kindly scheduled on my behalf, as though she had the right to arrange examinations of my mind the way one schedules a furnace check before winter, and when I asked the nurse who requested it, she hesitated and used the words "concerned family member," which tasted in my mouth like a euphemism for custodial ambition. I kept the appointment because I had nothing to fear from light and truth, and I answered the questions with the calm that comes from a lifetime of paying attention, recalling sequences of numbers, naming objects, drawing a clock whose hands pointed precisely where they were asked to point, and when the doctor, who had known Margaret and me for decades, told me my results were unremarkable and my memory sound for my age, I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with the wish that families might behave like families. 2 days later, a pair of social workers knocked on my door for a wellness check, triggered by an anonymous report of possible self-neglect, and they stepped into my foyer with that careful blend of warmth and authority that invites confidence while measuring cupboards. I showed them the pantry stocked with neatly labeled jars, the bathroom with rubber mats, and a handrail I had installed myself, the pill organizer filled correctly for the week, and the garden where I had pruned the roses the day before. They left with polite apologies, and I watched them confer by their car, their heads tilted toward each other in that posture of professionals who have seen something they do not often see, which is competence that does not ask to be rescued. Eleanor retaliated by switching to public theater. She cornered me at the grocery store where I pushed my cart slowly along the aisles on Thursdays, and she raised her voice just enough for nearby shoppers to hear as she scolded me for buying foods that were unsafe for a man in my condition, and she used words like sodium and dementia and wandering. And though the clerk who knows me well would not meet my eyes, I felt the blush creep up my neck in a way I had not felt since I was a boy. Rebuked by a teacher. I set down the can of soup as though it had become contraband and told her quietly that rumors are a form of theft because they take a person's reputation without paying for it. And she smiled in that impatient way and said I was being dramatic, that she was only looking out for me. And in that moment, I understood how modern cruelty works, not with beatings or bans, but with the loud performance of concern, until the victim internalizes the shame and volunteers to step aside. That evening she called to say she had spoken with the bank to flag my accounts for suspicious activity, since elderly men are often targeted by scams, and when I told her the only scam I recognized was the one that required me to relinquish control to my daughter, she hung up with a hard click that vibrated through the bones of the house. The next morning, the bank manager, a decent man who had watched us deposit paychecks for decades, phoned to confirm a requested change of address and the addition of a co-signer named Eleanor to one of my accounts. He suspected something was amiss because he had not heard it from me, and when I told him firmly that no changes were authorized and that any such request should be refused without my presence, he used a tone I had not heard since Margaret's illness, a tone that belongs to people who are finally brave enough to say aloud what everyone else has been whispering. "I'm sorry you have to go through this, Mr. Ellery. Tell me how to help you protect what's yours." The next blow fell at home, where I am supposed to be safest. I returned from a morning walk to find the back door unlatched and a thin draft moving down the hallway. And at first I thought I had been careless, a lapse that would please Eleanor's narrative, but the faint smell of Eleanor's perfume in the study turned my doubt into certainty. The desk drawers were closed, but not in the way my hands close them, and the small tin where I keep. Margaret's brooch sat at an unfamiliar angle, as if a stranger had set it down while listening for footsteps, and though nothing was missing that a thief would take, the envelope of photocopies lay open, its contents rifled as if by a curious bureaucrat. I stood in that doorway for a long minute, feeling the kind of violation that makes a person doubt his own senses, and I said aloud, to steady myself, that a house is not just wood and plaster, but a skin that remembers each touch, and it had remembered hers. I changed the locks that afternoon and added a chain to the back door, not to barricade myself against my own daughter, but to remind both of us that boundaries exist because love needs them just as much as fear does. I also made an appointment with the attorney who had helped us when Margaret's illness forced us to rewrite what we had hoped to postpone, and we sat in his small office lined with casebooks that smelled of dust and patience, and I told him everything. The laughter over clothes, the rehearsed concern, the forms pushed across the table, the phone call in which she spoke of me as a problem to solve, the wellness check, the bank, the unlocked door. He listened without interrupting, as men of his craft are trained to do, and then he advised 2 changes that felt like a weight lifted from my spine, not because they punished Eleanor, but because they honored Margaret's sense of fairness. He recommended that I move more of the estate into a trust with clear conditions that bypassed any intermediary who might be tempted by convenience, and he suggested a clause that would disinherit any heir who contested the will, not out of spite, but to remove the incentive to turn grief into litigation. I signed what needed signing, with a hand steadier than it had been in months, and I left his office with copies that meant nothing to a burglar and everything to a judge. I would be lying if I said there was no part of me that softened when the hammer finally struck the way it was always going to strike. Eleanor came on a Sunday without warning, without her armor of colleagues or clipboards, and she walked into the living room with an expression I had not seen since she was a teenager who had learned that the world could bruise back. She said very little at first, and when she did speak, her words were not arranged like arguments, but spilled like water that had been held too long in cupped hands, and she asked if she could sit at the desk because she needed to understand what I had done. A phrasing that recognized, perhaps for the first time, that what stands between a person and another's ambition is the work of will. I told her that the originals were no longer in the house, but that a copy of the current will was in the top drawer, and I watched the transformation in her face as she began to read. The lines that left the house not to her, but to the grandchildren, in a trust that would mature when they had built lives that would not be distorted by sudden inheritance, the provisions that set aside modest bequests for the church and the library and the Veterans Fund where Margaret had once volunteered, the careful language that provided for me while I lived and for them when I did not, and the clause that made it clear that anyone who tried to break this design would remove themselves from its benefits. At first she blinked with an almost offended incomprehension, as if expecting to find her destiny in the bold type and finding instead conditions and ethics, and then the color rose in her face and her mouth tightened, and she looked up at me with eyes that had lost their polish. She asked if this was a joke, a test, a temporary measure, and when I told her it was none of those and that it had been Margaret's wish and mine for years, she laughed once in disbelief, then once more in something like panic, and then to my astonishment she began to cry, not quietly, but with a rawness that made me want to reach for her even as I knew the touch would be rejected. Her tears did not soften her arguments, they sharpened them. She accused me of treachery, of loving the dead more than the living, of using the grandchildren as a shield against my own daughter. She said I was condemning her to the same fear she had known as a young woman when bills outnumbered paychecks, and Margaret clipped coupons at the kitchen table while I worked late, and she said that all her pushing and planning had been, in the end, an attempt to keep that fear from returning, and that if she had been hard on me it was because the sight of these old clothes in this old house pressed against the nerves that still remembered scarcity. For a moment I saw not the strategist, but the frightened child who once stood by the window watching for headlights that were late, the girl who wanted guarantees in a universe that offers none. And I felt the soft place in my heart that fathers reserve for daughters even when those daughters turn away. But compassion is not the same as capitulation, and love, if it is to remain love, must sometimes refuse. I told her that safety bought with someone else's dignity is not safety, but conquest, that Margaret and I had decided long ago that what we gave our grandchildren would not be a shortcut but a foundation, and that if she wished to benefit, the surest path was to become again the daughter who trusted that we had built wisely, not the executor of a plan to dismantle the house that had sheltered her. She slammed the drawer shut and stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor like a shout. She told me that I was forcing her hand, that if I would not be reasonable, then she would be forced to protect the family by other means, and the threat hung between us like a wire. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted in ways both petty and grand. She told the grandchildren that I was being unfair, and one of them, the boy, avoided my calls, while the girl, braver or perhaps simply more curious, texted late at night to ask whether it was true that the house would one day be theirs and not their mother's. And I answered with as much grace as the medium allowed, telling her that a house is not a prize but a responsibility, and that if it ever came to them, it would come with the obligation to be kinder than we had been to each other. Eleanor also attempted a bolder move, filing for temporary guardianship on the basis of declining capacity, a petition that arrived at my door folded inside official paper that smelled of courthouse dust. I took it to the same attorney who had helped me strengthen the trust, and he smiled sadly and said that such filings were more common than decent people imagine, and he scheduled an independent evaluation with a specialist whose questions were more rigorous than a checklist. I welcomed the scrutiny the way a man welcomes a clean mirror, and when the report came back, it did not merely say that I was competent, but described me as organized, lucid, and strongly oriented to person, place, time, and purpose, a phrase that felt like a benediction in a language I could trust. The petition was withdrawn before the hearing, but not before the clerk who called to notify me let slip, with the weary candor of someone who has seen too much, that these cases bleed families, and I thanked her for saying aloud what most only whisper. By the end of that second escalation, my world had not collapsed, but its fault lines had been mapped with cruel clarity. I had learned that my daughter's laughter was not careless, but tactical, that her concern was a mask for a hunger that she might not even fully recognize as fear, that the institutions meant to support the vulnerable can be weaponized by those who speak in the smooth dialect of management, and that the only defense against such a siege is the same mixture of patience and precision that Margaret taught me when we balanced a checkbook together at the kitchen table. I had also learned that the house can survive a draft and even a trespass if it's hard as elsewhere, and its doors are guarded by choices made long before the moment of attack. Most painfully, I had learned that love must sometimes stand still while a child flails against it, and that a father's refusal can be the only mercy left when every softer word has been spent. It was on a cold evening in late winter, when the air carried that brittle stillness before a storm, that the inevitable confrontation finally arrived. Eleanor came not with advisers, nor with pretexts of wellness or concern, but alone, as though at last she had decided to strike without disguise. I had lit a fire in the hearth, the flames throwing restless light across the living room, and when she entered, she did not remove her coat or offer the brief politenesses that once bridged our silences. She stood in the doorway staring at me with eyes sharpened by determination, and in her hand she held a folder, not one of mine but her own, neat, leather-bound, with papers already marked by colored tabs. She did not sit until I gestured, and even then her posture remained rigid, as though she were in a courtroom and not her childhood home. "Dad," she said, and her voice was low but tight, "we can't keep going like this. I've tried reason, I've tried patience, but you're forcing me into a corner. You may think you're protecting the family, but what you're really doing is creating chaos. You've made decisions that cut me out, decisions that humiliate me as your daughter. Do you understand how that feels? Do you have any idea what it's like to realize that your own father doesn't trust you?" I set aside the book I had been pretending to read because this moment was not one that could be ignored. I looked at her carefully, at the lines of stress etched deeper into her face than I remembered, and I said, "Trust is not a gift that can be demanded. It is something earned, Eleanor. And what you have shown me these months is not the care of a daughter, but the hunger of someone who sees her father's life as an account to be settled. You laughed at me, at my clothes, as though I were already obsolete, and you thought the papers I keep were nothing but relics. But they are the story of your mother and me. They are the protections we built for the future, and they are the proof that I still have a voice." She flinched at the word laughter, perhaps because she remembered it too vividly, but her anger surged back quickly. She opened her folder, sliding out a document. "This is a petition, Dad. I didn't want to use it, but I will if you leave me no choice. It's a request for guardianship. I can file it tomorrow, and believe me, the court will listen. You think your papers are unshakable, but once they decide you're unfit, everything changes. I don't want to humiliate you, but you're making it impossible for me to act any other way." For a long moment I said nothing. I listened to the fire crackle, to the faint whistle of wind against the chimney, and I remembered Margaret's voice, calm and steady, telling me that dignity is not a shield you can ask others to hold for you. It is something you carry yourself, even if the world strips everything else away. I rose slowly, not in anger, but in the weight of decision, and I walked to the desk where my own folders lay. From the top drawer I withdrew the most recent copy of the will and the trust documents, and I placed them on the table between us. "Read them again," I said. "Read every word. You think you hold power with that petition, but what I hold here is not fear, not secrecy. It is clarity. It is the design your mother and I made when we still believed you would honor what we left behind. The house, the accounts, the land. They are not yours to claim. They belong to the grandchildren, protected from misuse. The trust ensures it. The disinheritance clause enforces it. Even if you fight, you cannot change the terms without destroying your own claim. And if you proceed with your threat, you will cut yourself away entirely." Her hands trembled as she picked up the documents. She scanned the lines, and I saw the tears gather in her eyes before she blinked them back. "You're punishing me," she whispered. "You've chosen them over me, your own daughter. You've decided I'm unworthy." "No," I said quietly. "I've decided that love without respect destroys itself. I gave you chances to show care, to stand beside me, but you chose instead to plot, to belittle, to scheme. You tried to take what was not yet gone. That is not the act of a daughter who loves. It is the act of someone who covets. I will not let you destroy yourself by making greed your inheritance. If you cannot see that, then the papers must protect you from yourself." The silence stretched between us, heavy and absolute. She set down the documents, and for a moment her face softened, the mask of calculation slipping to reveal something raw, something almost childlike. She pressed her hands against her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked. "I was scared, Dad. I was scared of losing everything, of ending up with nothing. I thought if I took control, I could make sure it wouldn't happen. But you shut me out before I even had a chance to prove myself." I walked to her then, slowly, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not shake it off, but she did not lean into it either. "You had a chance," I said. "You had many, and you still have one if you choose it. Not through schemes, not through courts or signatures, but by remembering what it means to be family. That is the only way you will inherit what truly matters." Her tears came freely then, falling onto the table where the firelight caught them like glass. She closed her folder with a sharp snap as though ashamed of it, and for a moment I thought she might leave quietly. But instead she rose suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor, and her voice rose with it. "You've destroyed me, Dad. You've made me the villain in my own family. You'll see what this cost you. You'll see how alone you are." And with that she stormed from the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, the front door slamming so hard the windows rattled. I stood there in the silence that followed, my hands still resting on the back of the chair she had abandoned, and I felt both the exhaustion of battle and the strange calm of survival. The papers lay on the table, their words unaltered, their strength intact. For the first time I understood fully that this was the moment Margaret and I had prepared for, the moment when clarity would cut through chaos, when principle would outweigh fear. And though I had not won back my daughter, I had preserved the dignity she had tried to take from me, and in that I felt the steady warmth of justice flicker against the cold of her absence. In the weeks after that final confrontation, the house settled into a strange stillness, as if the walls themselves were recovering from the echoes of slammed doors and harsh words. I rose each morning to the familiar creak of the stairs, the rattle of the kettle, the rustle of newspapers slid through the slot, yet everything carried a new weight. not of dread, but of clarity. I knew that Eleanor would not return quickly. Her pride would not allow it, and perhaps her anger was too fresh. But I also knew that what had been done could not be undone. The trust was firm, the papers strong, and the house, though scarred by conflict, stood with its dignity intact. I had protected what Margaret and I built, and in that knowledge I found a strange calm that steadied me even as loneliness pressed harder against the edges of each day. Neighbors began to notice the absence of Eleanor's car in my driveway. Some asked if she was well, and I answered with the truth that she was alive, but that we were not speaking. And though their eyes softened with pity, I did not regret the words. For too long I had hidden behind excuses, pretending her coldness was only busyness, her laughter only carelessness. But now the truth was laid bare, and while it cost me dearly, it also freed me. I no longer waited for her footsteps on the porch or her voice on the telephone. Instead, I poured my energy into the grandchildren, writing them letters, small, careful notes that told stories about their mother when she was young, about Margaret's quiet strength, about the meaning of keeping faith with family even when the world seemed indifferent. The boy did not answer, at least not yet, but the girl wrote back, her words hesitant but curious, asking questions about her grandmother, about the history of the house, about what it meant to plant roots. Her letters became a light to me, a reminder that love, when watered with patience, can still grow even in rocky soil. The house itself seemed to conspire in my healing. I found myself repairing the loose stair that had groaned underfoot for years, mending the garden fence, repainting the porch where Eleanor once played with chalk as a child. Each act of care was not only for the house, but for myself, a way of saying that the past was not merely something to guard, but something to live within, with dignity. At night, I often sat at Margaret's old writing desk and read her letters, the ones she wrote in the last years when she feared she would not see our grandchildren grown. She had written with foresight, urging me to be strong, to resist despair, to remember that protecting our values was the last act of love we could offer. Those words became my prayer, my compass, and each time I closed her letters, I felt less like a man abandoned and more like a man entrusted. Word eventually reached me, through a mutual acquaintance, that Eleanor had spoken bitterly about me, that she told others her father had turned against her, had disowned her, had made her the villain of the family. For a moment those words cut deep, for no father wants to be painted as cruel. But then I remembered that truth does not need to shout. It endures in silence until it is recognized. I did not defend myself publicly, nor did I chase her down with explanations. I simply lived each day with the quiet integrity Margaret had taught me, knowing that time has a way of exposing falsehood. Whether Eleanor would one day see through her own anger, I could not say, but I no longer carried the burden of forcing that moment. My task was to remain faithful to what was right, to keep the fire burning even if she chose to stand outside in the cold. The greatest peace came one evening when I took a walk through the cemetery where Margaret rests. The air was sharp, the trees bare, and the ground covered in a thin frost that crunched beneath my shoes. I stood by her stone, brushing away the leaves that had gathered there, and I spoke aloud to her as I often did. I told her everything. The laughter at my clothes, the schemes for my papers, the petitions, the tears, the threats, and finally the decision that set our daughter apart from us. I told her that I had done as she asked, that I had defended what mattered, that I had not allowed fear to dictate our family's future. And as I stood there, the silence of the place wrapped around me, and for the first time in many months I felt not only grief, but a strange kind of triumph. I had been tested, and though I had lost much, I had not lost myself. When I returned home that evening, I lit the fire and sat in my chair, the house warm around me, and I realized that endings do not always come with reconciliation or with applause. Sometimes they come with a simple steadiness, a quiet knowledge that the choices we made were the right ones, even if they left us alone. I may never see Eleanor return through my door, or, if she does, it may not be in forgiveness, but in resignation. Yet I know that my dignity remains intact, my wife's wishes honored, my grandchildren's future protected. And in that knowledge there is a peace deeper than victory, the peace of having lived by one's principles, even when it cost dearly. That is the end of my story, or at least the end of this chapter. I am not a man without wounds, but I am a man still standing, still guarding the memory of love that was true, still believing that justice is not always loud, but is always steady. And if one day my daughter does come back, not with laughter or with petitions, but with humility, she will still find a father here, older and frailer perhaps, but unbroken, waiting with the quiet strength of one who has nothing left to prove and nothing left to surrender.